the elevator doors seal shut with a groan, and in that single heartbeat, the air inside turns electric. Trapped between two floors, a quiet, unremarkable Omega feels the identity he's hidden his entire life ignite without warning. And standing on either side of him are the two most feared alphas in the company, the notorious Ashgrove twins, their composure cracking as something primal takes over. What was meant to be a 2-minute errand becomes a collision neither of them can walk back from. Every breath drags their scent deeper into his blood, and every second the doors stay shut, the line between rescue and ruin blurs a little further. What really happened behind those steel doors on the 47th floor? And why did both alphas swear, afterward, that they'd never let him go? Get comfortable, because this is the story of a man who walked into an elevator as nobody in particular, and walked out as the one thing two ruthless CEOs couldn't stop thinking about. If you've ever been stuck somewhere with someone and felt the air shift for no reason you could explain, tell us about it in the comments. The elevator screamed to a stop between the 47th and 48th floors, and I understood, with the kind of certainty that lives in your stomach rather than your head, that my life had just been cut cleanly into a before and an after. The emergency light stuttered once, twice, and then steadied into a low amber glow that turned the mirrored walls into something out of a fever dream. Which felt about right, because my skin was already on fire and the elevator hadn't even finished shaking. Sweat had soaked clean through the back of my shirt, gluing the fabric to my spine. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, and I was gripping the folder in my arms like it was the only solid thing left in the world, which, in a very literal sense, it was. Inside it were the quarterly compliance documents that needed an executive signature by 5 o'clock, and delivering them was the entire reason I, Ren Sorrell, a junior auditor who had spent 3 years mastering the art of being forgettable at Ashgrove Dynamics, was standing in the executive elevator at all. The public lifts were down for inspection. My supervisor, Marisol, had waved a hand and said it would take 2 minutes. Go up, get the signature, come straight back. She had not mentioned that both Ashgrove brothers would be riding up together. She definitely had not mentioned that they'd be standing on opposite sides of the car in matching charcoal suits, and that the second the doors slid shut, the air between the three of us would go tight and electric, like the pressure drop before a storm. I'd fixed my eyes on the floor numbers ticking upward. 44, 45, 46. Just hold on a few more seconds. Just get through this without embarrassing myself in front of the two men who could end my career with a raised eyebrow. Then my skin had started to prickle, low and insistent, like the beginning of a sunburn from the inside out. My pulse kicked into a gallop. By the time the display read 47, I was lightheaded, and something hot and unfamiliar had started coiling low in my belly, spreading outward in slow, deliberate waves. That was when the elevator lurched and died, and the numbers stopped climbing altogether. No, I heard myself whisper, and my voice cracked on the single syllable. The folder slipped out of my arms. Papers fanned out across the floor in a mess of white. I pressed my back to the cool steel wall, trying to remember the mechanics of breathing, but every inhale dragged more of their scent into my lungs, and every exhale seemed to push something of my own back out into the small, sealed space. They smelled like cedar smoke and rain on hot asphalt, and something darker underneath that made my mouth water and my whole body ache in a way I had never once experienced in 24 years of living. It was overwhelming. It was humiliating. It was, above all, impossible, because I was a beta. I had always been a beta. Betas did not respond to alpha pheromones like this. They didn't tremble, didn't flush, didn't feel their own bodies turning traitor in the space of 90 seconds. Are you all right? The voice came from my left, even, deliberate, and it took me an embarrassingly long moment to place it as belonging to Callum Ashgrove, the CEO. I'd heard him talked about in hushed tones by the break room crowd, brilliant, glacial, a man who could dismantle a hostile takeover with 2 sentences, and never once raise his voice. He didn't sound cold now. There was an edge under the calm, something sharpened and watchful, and it made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I opened my mouth to say something professional. What came out instead was a broken half-gasp that didn't sound like me at all, and I watched Callum's expression shift in real time, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, his storm-gray eyes going from merely assessing to something considerably more dangerous. Callum. The second voice, rougher, closer to the edge of control. Reese, the CFO, The one office gossip swore could talk a shark out of its own teeth. Do you smell that? 3 heartbeats of silence. Yes, Callum said, very quietly. I had no idea what they were talking about. My thoughts had gone thick and slow, wading through static. Every nerve I owned had lit up at once, the recycled air moving over my damp skin, the drag of fabric against my thighs, my knees, threatening to give out beneath me. You need to sit down, Reese said, and there was something careful in his voice now, the tone you'd use on a spooked animal. Before you go down, he was right. My legs folded, and I slid down the wall in a heap of scattered paperwork, drawing my knees to my chest and trying, uselessly, to make myself smaller. It didn't help. Nothing helped. Another wave of heat crashed through me hard enough that I whimpered out loud, and underneath it something worse. An emptiness, a hunger, a need so total it blurred the edges of my vision. Please, I managed. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. I don't know what's happening to me. I broke off, because I genuinely didn't know what I needed. Only that I needed something, and that whatever it was lived somewhere in this elevator with me. Reese moved before his brother could stop him, crossing the small space in 3 quick strides and crouching down in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his skin. He held his hands up, open, the universal gesture of "I won't hurt you." "Hey," he said softly, "look at me. Can you look at me?" I dragged my eyes up. Up close he was worse, sharp-jawed, dark hair slightly mussed, gray eyes that seemed to see straight past every defense I had left. His scent was stronger here, and I found myself leaning toward him without deciding to. "There you go," he murmured. "Good, just breathe." "Slow, I can't," I gasped, another wave folding me forward until my forehead nearly touched my knees. Slick was soaking through my slacks now, and the shame of it burned hotter than the fever itself. "Something's wrong. I think I need a hospital. Ren." Callum's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding in a way that made me lift my head on reflex. He was standing over us, his face unreadable, but his eyes were blazing. "You're not sick. You're an Omega, and unless I am very much mistaken, this is your first heat." The words landed like a physical blow. I shook my head even as every cell in my body screamed the truth of it back at me. "That's not possible. I'm 24. If I were an Omega, I'd have presented years ago." "Late presentation is rare," Callum agreed, crouching to my level now, "but it happens. Usually it's triggered by extreme stress or prolonged proximity to a highly compatible alpha." Something dark moved across his face. Or, in this case, 2 compatible alphas whose combined scent just switched on everything your body's been suppressing. No. I shook my head harder, denial the only thing I had left to hold on to. "No, I can't be. I've never what?" Reese asked gently. "Felt like this. Been this hot it hurts. Had my body respond to someone's scent like it's the only thing keeping me alive." I stared at him, and he was right. He was completely right. I had spent 24 years believing I was a beta, and everything I knew about heats came from textbooks and secondhand stories, because I had never once felt this, never smelled pheromones like this, never been trapped this close to alphas like these 2. But the evidence was undeniable. The slick soaking through my clothes, the desperate ache carving itself into my core, my body screaming for something, only they seemed able to give it. "What do?" I whispered. "What happens now?" Callum knelt on my other side, boxing me in without quite touching me, his presence solid and grounding even as the heat radiating off him made my skin prickle. "Your body needs an alpha," he said, matter of fact. "Specifically, it needs alpha pheromones to help regulate your system. Without that, you're looking at hours, possibly days, of serious distress." I flinched. "Days?" "First heats are always the worst," Reese said softer. "Your body doesn't know what it's doing yet, and it will keep escalating until it gets what it needs." "And what does it need?" I asked, though I already knew, could feel the answer in every cell, in the way I was leaning toward them without meaning to, in the way my mouth watered at the thought of their skin against mine. Callum's eyes met his brother's over my head, some silent exchange passing between them. "We have options," Callum said finally. "Option 1, you refuse our help, and the 3 of us wait this out until the elevator's repaired. You'll be in significant pain. We'll be fighting our own instincts the entire time. And if your heat spikes unchecked, there's a real risk of fever shock." I swallowed. "Option 2, Reese continued. You let us help manage the worst of it through scent and touch. No more than that." "Option 3, Callum said. You accept what your body's asking for, and you let us take care of you properly. No half measures. We'd be your alphas, Ren. If you wanted us to be. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they sent a pulse of want straight through my core, and more slick gathered between my thighs at the mere thought. I can't, I managed. This is wrong. I just need to wait for the elevator, and then I can go home and deal with this myself. Reese made a low, rough sound in his throat. Ren, listen to me. A first heat hitting this fast, this hard, with no suppressants and no warning. If you try to ride it out alone, you could end up hospitalized. This isn't about want. It's biology. Then both of you need to stay away from me, I said, pressing myself harder against the wall. Your scent is making it worse. Something flickered in Callum's jaw, and then, unexpectedly, he did the opposite of what I'd braced for. He shifted back, putting distance between us, and let a slow, deliberate wave of calming pheromone fill the space instead. It felt like cool water on a burn. Breathe, he said quietly. Focus on my voice. We won't touch you without permission. But Reese is right about one thing. Your scent is already affecting both of us, and the longer we're stuck in here, the harder that's going to be to control. What does that mean? I asked, though part of me already knew. It means, Reese said, voice rougher now, you're putting off mating pheromones strong enough to trigger a rut in any alpha nearby. We're both fighting it. We won't be able to fight it forever. The words should have frightened me. Instead, some reckless, unfamiliar part of me answered with a fresh pulse of need. A whimper slipped out of me, a sound I had never made in my life, and I watched both of them react instantly. Muscles tightening, eyes darkening with something primal. I'm sorry, I gasped, mortified. I can't control it. Don't apologize, Callum said, his voice fraying at the edges despite his obvious effort to hold it together. None of this is your fault. But it is happening, Reese said, taking a step closer despite his brother's warning glance. And we need to decide, right now, how we're handling the next however many minutes. Because Ren, you smell unbelievable, and I am maybe 5 minutes from losing my mind entirely. The blunt honesty sent another wave crashing through me, strong enough to make the room tilt. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to think through the fog. Option 2, I whispered finally. Scent and touch, nothing more. And you have to promise, this doesn't leave this elevator. Tomorrow we go back to normal. Silence stretched. We can't promise normal, Reese said quietly. Not after this, but we can promise discretion. Whatever happens here stays between the three of us. Callum nodded. And if at any point you want us to stop, you only have to say so. Understood? Yes, I said shakily. Understood. Please, I need help. It's getting worse. Neither of them moved right away, even then. A last, deliberate pause, as if some part of both of them needed one more second to be entirely certain this was really happening, that I really meant it before anything else could begin. It was, looking back, the clearest sign either of them ever gave me of exactly how careful they intended to be with something they both very obviously already understood mattered. Reese reached me first, closing the distance with a kind of contained, predatory patience. He knelt beside me without touching, letting his scent wash over me. Cedar smoke, something entirely his own that made my body arch toward him on instinct. Easy, he murmured, brushing damp hair back from my forehead. His fingers were cool against my burning skin, and the simple contact made me gasp and lean into his palm. You're doing so well. We're going to take care of you. Callum settled on my other side, and suddenly I was bracketed between them, wrapped in a scent that both soothed and inflamed in the same breath. When his hand came to rest on my shoulder, something in me loosened even as the need kept climbing. Tell us what you need, Callum said, low and even. We'll follow your lead. I don't know, I admitted, desperate. Everything hurts, everything aches. I need something, and I don't know what. What followed I remember less as a sequence of events than as a single unbroken wave. Riss's hand sliding from my forehead to the curve of my jaw, gathering me against his chest. Callum's palm settling at the back of my neck, steady, grounding. The strange, overwhelming relief of being held by both of them at once. My mind finally going quiet after what felt like hours of static. Good, Callum said against my hair. Your heartbeat's slowing. How does this feel? Safe, I whispered, surprised by my own honesty. It feels safe. Both of them went very still at that. Reese's arms tightened, and Callum pressed his forehead briefly to the back of my head. For a long moment, we simply breathed together in the dim emergency light. The heat still burning under my skin, but less like drowning now, more like being anchored in a current too strong to fight alone. It didn't stay that way. Another wave built, sharper than the last, and by the time it crested, I was rocking forward instinctively, chasing pressure, chasing anything that might ease the hollow ache carving itself deeper with every second. "Ren," Callum said, strain audible now. "We need to know how far you want this to go. Your scent's getting stronger, and we are both very close to the edge. I can smell it on you too," Reese added quietly, his mouth close to my ear. "Every instinct I have is telling me to give you what your body's asking for. The honesty of it should have shocked me. Instead, it sent fresh heat rolling through me, and I found myself pressing closer instead of pulling away. "Touch me," I heard myself say. "Please. I need your hands on me." "Where?" Callum asked, his hands sliding down my spine. "Everywhere. I don't care. Just don't stop." What happened next I won't set down in detail, because some things are private even in the retelling, even to myself. I will only say that they moved together with an ease that startled me even through the haze, that every touch was deliberate, patient, checking in without ever quite breaking the rhythm of it, that somewhere between the fear and the fever, I stopped being afraid of what my body was asking for, and started, instead, to trust the two men answering it. There was a moment, clear-eyed, suspended, when Reese's mouth found the curve of my throat, right over the scent gland there, teeth grazing but not breaking skin, and he pulled back before either of us could lose ourselves completely. "Not that," he said, voice rough. "Not on a broken elevator, not on a first heat. Whatever else happens tonight, not that." I didn't have the words to answer him. I only pulled him closer, and let the two of them carry me the rest of the way through the worst of it, hour blurring into hour, until somewhere near the end my fever finally began mercifully to break. When I came back to myself, I was wrapped in both their jackets, sandwiched between them on the elevator floor, and the ache had gone from unbearable to merely tender. My mind felt clear again for the first time in what might have been hours. "Oh God," I whispered into the quiet. "What did we just do?" Callum found my hand and laced his fingers through mine. "We got you through your first heat," he said simply, "and found our Omega doing it." The elevator chose that exact moment to shudder back to life with a cheerful little chime that felt obscene given the circumstances. The lights brightened. The car resumed its climb toward the 48th floor. Panic seized me. We were disheveled, marked, undeniably compromised, and about to arrive somewhere. "Don't panic," Reese said, reading my face. "This car opens straight into our private suite. No one else has floor access." He was right. The doors slid open on an empty reception area, and Callum was already up, gathering our scattered things with brisk efficiency, draping his own jacket over my shoulders before ushering us both through to a suite beyond. A wide office, floor-to-ceiling windows, a private bathroom with a shower more than large enough for three. They took turns helping me clean up, unhurried and careful, murmuring something like reassurance the entire time. When we emerged, Callum had laid fresh clothes out on the leather sofa. Simple things, clearly kept on hand for exactly this kind of emergency, though I didn't let myself wonder too hard about that. I dressed slowly, my body pleasantly worn in ways I had never experienced, my mind still stumbling to catch up with everything that had happened. "Ren," Callum said quietly, "we need to talk about what happens next." My heart started pounding again, for entirely different reasons than it had in the elevator. The full weight of the last several hours came crashing down all at once. I had just been intimate with both of my bosses, the two most powerful men in the company, the twin alphas who could end my career with a single phone call. "I wasn't thinking clearly," I said, wrapping my arms around myself despite the fresh clothes. "None of this would have happened if I hadn't been in heat. I should go home. We can all just pretend this never happened." Reese leaned in the bathroom doorway, arms crossed, gray eyes serious. "Is that really what you want? To pretend? What else can we do?" Frustration sharpened my voice more than I intended. "You're both my bosses. This was a biological accident. Tomorrow I have to come back to work and face everyone, knowing that we—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Callum came closer, though he stopped short of touching distance, respecting the space I clearly needed. "What happened in there wasn't only biology," he said. "Yes, your heat triggered our response, but the kind of resonance the three of us have, that doesn't happen randomly." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Reese answered, pushing off the doorframe, "that you're our mate, both of ours. The way your body settled the moment we touched you, the way holding you felt like something finally clicking into place, that's not fever, that's fate if you believe in that sort of thing, and if you don't, it's still true." I shook my head, frantic. "You can't possibly know that from one encounter. This is insane. I need to go home. I need time to think. Then go home, Callum said, surprising me. We won't force anything on you that you're not ready for. He stepped close enough that I could feel the warmth off his skin. But you should understand, after tonight, there's no pretending your way back to normal. Whether you accept it yet or not, something in us has already claimed you as ours. The certainty in his voice sent a shiver through me that was equal parts fear and something far more dangerous. I need time, I said, as firmly as I could manage. Please, just give me space to process this. They exchanged another one of those silent, wordless conversations twins seem born knowing how to have. Then Reese nodded slowly. We'll give you space, he said, but you're not coming into work tomorrow. First heats take days to recover from properly. We'll have what you need sent to your apartment. I don't need you taking care of me, I protested weakly. Yes, Callum said, flat and certain. You do. You're our Omega now, whether you've accepted it or not, and we take care of what's ours. Before I could argue further, he'd already called for a car to take me home. The ride home passed in a blur. My apartment, one small room above a dry cleaner's, the kind of place that had always felt like enough, suddenly felt impossibly small, filled up with everything I now knew about myself and couldn't unknow. I collapsed onto my bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the person I'd been that morning, a quiet, invisible auditor with whoever I was now. Sleep came anyway, dragging me under with the force of pure exhaustion. I dreamed of storm-gray eyes and cedar smoke, of steady hands and low voices murmuring praise, and woke the next morning to someone knocking, hard and insistent, on my door. It was a delivery courier, half hidden behind an absurd stack of bags and boxes. Delivery for Ren Sorrel, she announced cheerfully, and pushed past me before I could form a coherent objection. She unpacked with brisk efficiency. Fresh groceries for several days, high-grade supplements formulated for Omegas recovering from a first heat, a stack of soft blankets that, I realized with a full-body flush, carried the unmistakable trace of cedar and rain on asphalt. A bouquet of white roses sat on top of it all, a card tucked into the ribbon. Take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready. No names. They hadn't needed to sign it. I sat with the roses for a long time before I let myself cry. Not from sadness, exactly, but from the sheer disorientation of being cared for so completely by two people I'd spent 3 years carefully not looking directly at across conference rooms. I'd built my entire adult life around not needing anyone, around being competent enough and quiet enough that no one ever had a reason to look twice. And here was proof, stacked on my kitchen counter, that looking twice had already happened. And there was no undoing it now. I called in sick for the rest of the week, which wasn't entirely a lie. Marisol, my supervisor, texted twice to check I was all right, and I answered both messages with something vague about a stomach bug, grateful that betas apparently got convincing stomach bugs often enough that no one questioned it. After the courier left, I stood in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by evidence of their care, and felt something crack open quietly in my chest. They weren't pushing. They weren't demanding anything. They were simply showing me, through action, that they'd meant every word. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended haze of recovery and reflection. My body healed fast. The soreness faded into something almost fond. My mind was slower to catch up. I couldn't stop replaying every moment, every touch, every word, the particular way both of them had checked on me, over and over, even in the grip of their own instincts. I told myself it was residual hormone fog. Deep down, I knew it wasn't only that. I spent an embarrassing number of hours reading everything the internet had on late-onset presentation. The accounts were eerily similar to mine. A triggering event, usually proximity to a highly compatible alpha, followed by an intense first heat that often ended in some form of bonding. The clinical articles talked about pheromone compatibility indices and biological imperative. The personal accounts talked about something else entirely. They talked about finding a piece of yourself you hadn't known was missing. One thread stopped me cold, a forum post from someone describing suppressant regimens administered from early childhood by well-meaning guardians who'd wanted to spare a child the vulnerability of presenting as an Omega in a world that could be cruel to them. I read it twice, and then a third time, something uneasy settling in my stomach. I had grown up in the foster system. I had been on hormonal stabilizers since I was 6 years old, prescribed by a state physician after a series of medical evaluations no one had ever fully explained to me. I had always assumed it was standard practice. It had never once occurred to me to ask what exactly those stabilizers had been for. I filed the thought away, unable to sit with it yet, and on the second night my phone rang. Reese's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for 4 full rings before I answered. "Hey," he said, and something in the simple word made my chest ache. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I admitted. "Physically, anyway. And the rest of it? Complicated," I said honestly. I keep telling myself this was a one-time thing brought on by biology. And then I keep not quite believing myself. A pause warm rather than awkward. "Callum and I aren't going to pressure you into anything," Reese said. "But would it be all right if we called sometimes?" No pretending, no pressure, just talking. I should have said no. Instead, I found myself saying, "Yeah, that would be okay." That was how it started, not with a declaration, but with phone calls that stretched later into the night than either of us probably intended, and small deliveries that arrived without fanfare. And, on the 4th day, Callum himself standing on my doorstep with a bag of soup from the place 2 blocks over that I hadn't told either of them I liked. "I asked your coworker Priya," he admitted before I could ask. Discreetly, I promise, I let him in anyway, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't mind the idea of him asking questions about me at all, that some small, previously guarded part of me had actually enjoyed being someone worth asking about. We sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, because I owned exactly 1 chair, and it wasn't built for 2 people, and ate soup out of paper cartons while he told me, without my having to ask, about the early years of building Ashgrove Dynamics from a 2-room office with Reese, the long nights, the investors who doubted 2 brothers barely out of business school, the slow, hard-won proof that they didn't need their father's approval or his money to build something real. It was the first time he'd spoken to me like an equal instead of like someone he was carefully managing, and I understood, watching him, that this, the unguarded version, soup carton balanced on 1 knee, tie long since discarded, was rarer than anything I'd seen of him in the elevator or the boardroom both. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked. "Because you asked," he said simply. "Most people don't." I thought about that for a long time after he left. The weeks that followed didn't look like anything I would have called a whirlwind romance. At least, not at first. They looked like Reese showing up to walk me home some evenings, keeping a careful, respectful distance the entire way. They looked like Callum, who I'd once assumed didn't know how to be anything but formidable, sending me articles about my newly discovered biology with actual, genuine concern in the margins of his texts. They looked like long dinners where I learned, slowly, that the twin CEOs everyone at Ashgrove Dynamics whispered about in half-admiring, half-terrified tones were, underneath all of it, 2 brothers who had built an empire out of the wreckage of a father who'd cared more about his company than his sons, and who had learned early that the only people they could fully trust were each other. Our father used to say an alpha who needed anyone was an alpha who could be leveraged. Callum told me one night, turning a wine glass slowly between his fingers, not quite meeting my eyes. "We were raised to be self-sufficient to the point of isolation. Reese is the only person I let myself need for 31 years. Until the elevator," Reese said, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Until the elevator," Callum agreed. Something in my chest twisted, warm, and unfamiliar. I understood in that moment that whatever this was becoming, it wasn't casual for either of them, and it terrified me exactly as much as it thrilled me. Work was harder. I hadn't told anyone at the office what had happened, and I intended to keep it that way, but rumor has its own gravity, and 3 weeks of unexplained absence followed by a very obvious new wariness whenever the Ashgrove brothers were in the room did not go unnoticed. Priya cornered me in the break room and asked, point blank, if I was seeing someone important, and I choked on my coffee badly enough that she laughed and let it go. For the moment. Others weren't so kind. A woman from marketing named Delphine, who had made her interest in Callum fairly public over the years, started making pointed little comments whenever I passed her desk. Comments about some people getting special treatment, about knowing how to angle for a promotion. I told myself it didn't matter. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. "Ignore her," Reese said when I finally reluctantly mentioned it. His jaw had gone tight in a way that made me suspect Delphine would be having a significantly worse week very soon. "She doesn't know anything." "She doesn't need to know anything to make my life miserable," I said. "I still have to work here." Callum's expression when I told him was more unreadable, and considerably more dangerous. You won't have to worry about her, he said, in a tone that made it very clear the matter was already closed. I didn't ask what that meant. Delphine transferred to the Chicago office within the month. It wasn't only Delphine, though she'd been the loudest. There was a slower, quieter current running underneath the gossip. The sense, among some of the senior staff, that a junior auditor dating not one but both Ashgrove brothers was either the luckiest person in the building or the most calculating, and that there was no version of the story where I got to simply be a person who'd fallen in love. I overheard enough of it in doorways and elevator, waiting areas to start dreading the walk from my desk to the break room. I didn't tell Reese and Callum most of it. I told Priya instead, one evening over noodles at the place near my old apartment, half expecting her to look at me differently too. She didn't. For what it's worth, she said, twirling noodles around her chopsticks without looking up. You were the same quiet, slightly awkward person who used to alphabetize the supply closet for fun before any of this happened. If people can't hold both things in their head at once, that's a them problem. It doesn't feel like a them problem when it's my career on the line. So don't let it be. She finally looked up. You could ask for a transfer to a different division. There's an opening in forensic accounting, and frankly you're wasted doing quarterly compliance checks anyway. Get some distance from the rumor mill. Let your work speak instead of your love life. It was, infuriatingly, good advice. I put in for the transfer the following week, half expecting Callum to quietly veto it, or worse, quietly arrange it in my favor the way he'd arranged Delphine's exit. He did neither. When I told him what I'd done, he simply nodded, something like respect in his expression. Good, he said. You shouldn't have to build your reputation in my shadow, or Riss's. The forensic accounting transfer went through on its own merits. My numbers, not my relationships, and for the first time since the elevator, I felt like I was standing on ground I'd built myself. It mattered more than either of them, for all their instinct to smooth every obstacle out of my path seemed to fully understand at first. It took a long conversation and more than one small argument before they did. I don't need you to fix every hard thing for me, I told Reese, after he'd nearly intervened a second time over an unrelated slight from a colleague. Sometimes I need you to let me handle it and just be there afterward. He'd looked for a moment, genuinely startled, like the idea of standing back and doing nothing had never once occurred to him as an option. That's going to take practice, he admitted. I've got time, I said, and meant it. It helped, too, that forensic accounting turned out to genuinely suit me. The slow, careful work of tracing a discrepancy back to its source, the satisfaction of a ledger that finally balanced after weeks of digging. My new supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Idris Cole, had no discernible opinion about my personal life whatsoever, which was, after months of whispered speculation, its own kind of relief. 6 months in, she recommended me for a lead role on an internal audit that had nothing to do with either Ashgrove brother and everything to do with my own actual skill, and I nearly cried in the elevator on the way back to my desk. The regular one, this time, thankfully. You look pleased with yourself, Reese observed that evening when I told him. I earned something today that had nothing to do with either of you, I said. It felt good. It should, he said, without a trace of the possessiveness I might have braced for a year earlier. You built that. 3 months in, Callum asked me to attend the company's annual gala, not as an employee slipping in through a side door, but on his arm publicly in front of the entire board and half the city's business press. Are you sure? I asked, staring at the invitation like it might bite me. Once people see us together, there's no taking it back. We don't want to take it back, Reese said, appearing behind me to rest his chin on top of my head, a habit I still hadn't gotten used to and privately never wanted him to stop. We want everyone to know exactly who you are to us. I said yes before I'd fully decided to, and spent the following week half convinced I'd made a terrible mistake and half thrilled every time I let myself think about it properly. Priya, sworn to secrecy under threat of never receiving another one of my terrible puns again, helped me pick out something to wear that wasn't, in her words, auditor adjacent, and stood in my kitchen the night before with a curling iron and an alarming amount of opinions about my hair. You know this changes everything, right? She said, not unkindly, twisting a section of hair around the barrel. Once you walk in on his arm, there's no quietly going back to being invisible. I know, I said, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the thought didn't scare me nearly as much as it would have 3 months earlier. The gala was every bit as overwhelming as I'd feared. Chandeliers, a string quartet, more old money in one ballroom than I'd ever stood near in my life. But the steadying presence of Callum's hand at my back and Reese's easy, constant nearness on my other side made it bearable, even, eventually, something close to enjoyable. It was near midnight, on the terrace overlooking the skyline, that everything shifted. Callum found me alone for a moment. Reese had been pulled into a conversation with an investor and pressed something small and warm into my hand. "I know we said we'd let this happen at your pace," he said, uncharacteristically unsteady. "But I need you to know what I want, what we both want. If you're ready to hear it." I opened my hand. A ring sat in my palm. Not an engagement ring, I realized after a moment of confused panic, but a bonding cuff, the kind alphas gave omegas ahead of a formal mating bite, worn on the wrist rather than the finger, a request rather than a claim. "Callum, you don't have to answer tonight," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know it exists, that we're not going anywhere, whatever you decide." I looked at the cuff and then at him and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that I had already decided weeks ago and simply hadn't let myself say it out loud. "I want this," I said. "I want both of you. I have for a while." Reese found us a few minutes later. Callum had texted him. I learned afterward, the second I'd said yes, and the three of us slipped away from the gala entirely, back to their private suite on the 48th floor, the same rooms where all of this had started. I won't describe what followed in detail. Some nights belong only to the people who lived them. I will say that it was slower than the elevator had been, and warmer, entirely unhurried, full of the kind of tenderness that made the fever of that first night look, in retrospect, like only the opening note of something much longer and much deeper. Somewhere near dawn, with the city lights just beginning to go gold outside the window, Reese pressed his mouth to the scent gland at my throat and asked, one more time, if I was certain. "I'm certain," I told him, and felt the mark settle into my skin, like something coming home rather than something being taken. Hours later, in the quiet after, Callum did the same, and I understood finally what they had meant about resonance, two separate bonds, and yet somehow one single unbroken thing. It was Reese, weeks later, who finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. "You mentioned once you were on hormone stabilizers as a kid," he said carefully, over breakfast in the apartment we'd started, without quite discussing it formally, treating as a shared space. "Do you know who prescribed them, or why?" I set down my fork. A state physician. I was in foster care. I never really questioned it. I assumed it was routine. Reese and Callum exchanged one of their looks. "It's not routine," Callum said carefully. "Not at that dosage, not starting that young. Ren, those aren't stabilizers. Based on what you've described, that's a suppressant protocol strong enough to mask secondary presentation entirely. Someone made a deliberate decision to keep you from presenting as an omega." The floor seemed to tilt slightly. Why would anyone do that? It took 2 more weeks, a private investigator Callum trusted, and a paper trail that wound back through 3 different agencies before we had an answer, and it was not the one I expected. My biological father, it turned out, had been an omega rights advocate who died under circumstances the official record called an accident, and Callum's investigator called considerably less accidental, after uncovering a black market bonding ring that trafficked young, unpresented omegas to wealthy alphas willing to pay for a guaranteed match. My father had been building a case against the ring's organizers. The suppressants, it turned out, had been arranged, quietly, illegally, at real risk to whoever authorized them, by a family friend who'd gotten me into the foster system under a different surname specifically to keep me off that ring's radar until I aged out of danger. "You were protected," Callum said gently, when we finally sat down with everything laid out. "Someone made sure of it, at real cost to themselves. I'd like to find out who, if you want that. I did want that, eventually. But in the moment, staring at 2 decades of my life recontextualized in the space of an afternoon, all I could manage was, 'I need a minute.' They gave me several. When I was ready to talk again, it was Reese who said, quietly, 'For what it's worth, I'm glad whoever it was did what they did. I don't love the idea of a world where we never met you in that elevator.' Neither do I admitted, and meant it more than I expected to. It took another few weeks before curiosity finally overcame my hesitation enough to ask Callum's investigator for whatever details existed about my father. I'd grown up with almost nothing, a name on a birth certificate, a handful of vague notes in a case file I'd never been allowed to read in full. What came back this time was thin but real, a photograph, grainy and official, of a man with my exact jaw and none of my coloring, standing outside a courthouse with a stack of files under one arm. A copy of an op-ed he'd written 18 months before he died, arguing plainly, angrily, that legal protections for unpresented Omega minors were being quietly stripped away by lobbyists with a direct financial interest in exactly the kind of trafficking ring that would later come looking for me. I read it 3 times in one sitting, in our kitchen, long after Callum and Reese had gone to bed, and found myself crying in a way I hadn't expected and didn't entirely understand. Grief, mostly, for a person I'd never known and would never get the chance to. Underneath the grief was something else, quieter and harder to name, the strange, steadying knowledge that somewhere at the root of everything that had happened to me, someone had fought and lost, so that I would eventually get the chance to end up exactly here. I didn't go looking for the family friend who'd arranged the suppressants and the new surname. Callum's investigator found her anyway, a retired caseworker named Odalis Farran, living quietly 2 states away, who went nearly speechless when a car from Ashgrove Dynamics pulled up outside her house with a young man she hadn't seen since he was 6 years old. "You look like him," she told me over tea in her small, plant-crowded kitchen, eyes wet. "I used to wonder whether I'd made the right call, whether keeping you from knowing what you were meant, keeping you from something you deserved to have sooner. But you were safe. That was always the whole point." "You saved my life," I told her, and watched her cry properly for the first time since I'd walked through her door. Before I left that afternoon, she pressed an old, water-stained photograph into my hand. My father, younger than I'd ever pictured him, laughing at something out of frame, one arm slung around a woman I didn't recognize. "Your mother," Odalis said quietly, when she saw my face. "She passed not long after you were born. Complications. He raised you alone those first few years before everything happened. He loved you fiercely, for the short time he had you. I want you to know that, whatever else you learn." I kept the photograph in my wallet after that, tucked behind a card I never used, and found myself taking it out more often than I expected to. Not out of grief, exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but out of a quiet, growing sense of having finally been handed the missing first chapter of my own story. I visited her twice more that year, and every year after. It didn't erase the strangeness of learning, still only 24, that an entire chapter of my own history had been deliberately hidden from me for my own protection. But it gave the strangeness a shape I could finally hold, instead of a wound I could only avoid touching. The ring itself, it turned out, had mostly been dismantled years earlier by the very investigation my father had died pursuing, its last remaining threads unraveled by Callum's people within another month. It wasn't closure, exactly, but it was an ending, and I was surprised by how much I needed one. The trouble arrived, as it so often does in that world, wearing a very good suit. His name was Alaric Voss, and he ran a holding company that had spent the better part of a decade circling Ashgrove Dynamics like a patient shark, waiting for a moment of weakness to force a merger neither Callum nor Reese had ever wanted. That moment, as far as Voss was concerned, had just arrived, because a company whose CEO and CFO were both visibly, publicly bonded to the same unassuming former junior auditor made, in his estimation, a very good story for the business press, and a very good lever for a hostile board vote. "He's going to try to paint this as a conflict of interest," Callum said grimly, spreading a folder of Voss's public statements across our kitchen table one evening, Iris's crayon drawings still scattered at the far end where she'd abandoned them for dinner. "Suggests that decisions are being made based on personal attachment rather than sound judgment. It's a weak argument, but weak arguments have moved boards before." "So what does he actually want?" I asked. "Leverage," Reese said. "Either we fold some of our decision-making authority over to a joint oversight committee, which he'd get himself appointed to, or he takes the story to the press first and lets public pressure do the work for him." I felt the old, familiar flicker of guilt, the sense that I had, however unintentionally, made myself into a liability for 2 men who had built something extraordinary long before I stepped into their elevator. "Maybe I should stay out of the public side of things for a while," I said. "Skip the press events. Let the story die down." Callum's expression sharpened instantly. "Absolutely not. He's not wrong that it would take away his angle. He's counting on you thinking that, Reese said, more gently but just as firm. The moment we let him make you disappear from view, we've told the entire board that our own bond is something to be ashamed of, something to be managed rather than something real. We're not doing that. Not to you and not to us. It took 2 weeks of careful, occasionally exhausting strategy to answer Voss properly, not by hiding, but by making the truth impossible to spin into a scandal. Callum gave a rare, deliberately candid interview about the company's governance structure, laying out in exacting detail exactly how decisions were made and reviewed, leaving no room for the conflict of interest narrative to take root. Reese, with a ruthlessness that still occasionally surprised me, quietly uncovered and leaked, through entirely legal channels. He was careful to note evidence that Voss's own holding company had been using far more questionable practices to influence 2 smaller boards the previous year. I did my own part, though it took more nerve than either strategy session. At the next public event, instead of staying carefully in the background as I might have a year earlier, I stood beside them both, gave my own short statement to a reporter who asked, plainly, honestly, without flourish, about how the 3 of us had built a life and a working relationship that didn't compromise either. People are allowed to be more than one thing, I told her. I'm an auditor. I'm also part of this family. Neither of those facts makes the other one less true. It ran the next morning under a headline considerably kinder than Voss had been hoping for. His proposed board vote failed by a wide enough margin that he didn't bother trying again for the rest of the year. You didn't have to do that, Callum said that night, once Iris was down and the 3 of us had finally exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. I wanted to, I said. I'm tired of being the thing people whisper about instead of the person I actually am. Reese pulled me into his side, pressing a kiss to my temple. For what it's worth, he said, you were magnificent. I was terrified. Both things can be true, he said, echoing my own words back at me, and I laughed despite myself. Idris sent me a short, dry congratulatory email the next morning. Good work staying off the front page for the wrong reasons, which I saved and reread more than once over the following weeks, absurdly proud of a compliment that had nothing to do with either of my mates, and everything to do with the work I'd actually done. Not long after the bond had settled between us, sitting in the quiet of a Sunday morning, we made the decision, together, deliberately, none of us rushing it, to start a family. I won't pretend the road there was simple. As a bonded omega with 2 alpha mates, my body's biology worked differently than either of the pregnancy books we bought seemed to fully account for. Some triads chose medically assisted timing to manage which alpha's contribution took, and after several long conversations, we chose to let it happen naturally and see what came of it. Are you sure? I'd asked Reese, half joking, half serious, watching him pace our kitchen with a stack of parenting books under one arm. You've never once seemed like the type to want anything to be left to chance. For this, he said, I'll make an exception. 6 weeks later, I sat on the edge of our bathtub holding a plastic stick with 2 lines on it, my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with heat this time. I'm pregnant, I said, when they found me, and I watched 29 years of careful alpha composure dissolve out of both of them at once. Reese dropping to his knees in front of me, pressing his forehead to my stomach before either of us had even fully processed the sentence. Callum standing frozen in the doorway with an expression I'd genuinely never seen on him before. The 9 months that followed were their own kind of chaos. Reese reading every pregnancy book in print, Callum quietly rearranging his entire schedule to make every appointment, both of them hovering with an intensity that occasionally made me want to scream, and, more often, made me feel unbearably loved. There was a frightening week near month 7, when early contractions sent us to the hospital at 2 a.m, both of them white-knuckled in the waiting room, until the doctors confirmed it was a false alarm. There was a night, closer to the end, when Callum admitted quietly, in the dark, that he was terrified of not knowing how to be a father, given the example he'd had, and Reese, without hesitation, told him he already was one, simply by being afraid of getting it wrong. Labor, when it actually came, arrived 2 days past her due date and lasted 11 hours, most of which I spent alternating between gripping Riss's hand, hard enough to bruise, and snapping at Callum, for reading pregnancy statistics out loud in what he clearly thought was a calming tone of voice. If you tell me one more time what percentile of labor duration I'm currently in, I gasped, somewhere around hour 8, I will personally throw that tablet out the window. Understood, Callum said, and set it face down on the windowsill without further comment, though I caught him checking it twice more when he thought I wasn't looking. Reese, for his part, said almost nothing useful the entire 11 hours and was, somehow, the most helpful person in the room. A steady hand, a cool cloth pressed to my forehead at exactly the right moments, a low, calm voice reminding me to breathe whenever the contractions came hard enough to steal the rhythm of it away from me. It was, I would tell him much later, the single clearest window I'd ever had into what he must have been like in that elevator 6 years earlier, before either of us had known what we were to each other, back when steadiness was the only thing either of us had to offer the other. Our daughter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 7 pounds, furious at the entire process, with a full head of dark hair and, the moment she stopped crying long enough to open her eyes, an unmistakable pair of storm-gray irises. Absolutely perfect, Reese said, tears he didn't bother hiding running down his face. 3 months later, the paternity results came back. Biologically, she was Callum's. It didn't matter in any way that counted. Watching the two of them pass her back and forth in our living room, watching her gum contentedly on Riss's finger while Callum hummed something tuneless and off-key, I understood that biology had very little to do with what made her ours. We named her Iris. 5 years later, I stood in the nursery we'd prepared for our second child, one hand resting on my swollen belly. Yes, we'd decided to do it again, unable to resist the idea of adding one more small, impossible person to this family we'd built out of a broken elevator and a series of decisions none of us had fully expected to make. This pregnancy had been easier. My body knew, this time, what it was doing. My mind was steadier, too. I'd learned, over the years, to set the boundaries I hadn't known how to set that first year, to accept their fierce protectiveness without disappearing under it entirely. It was a balance we'd built slowly, through trial and a fair number of arguments, into something that actually worked. Standing there, feeling our son kick hard against my palm, I understood their old instinct to hover in a way I hadn't fully understood the first time. This tiny, insistent life was proof of everything we'd built. Callum appeared in the doorway, his whole expression softening the moment he saw me. "How are my 2 favorite people?" "3 favorite people," I corrected, smiling. "Don't forget Iris." "Never," he murmured, crossing to wrap his arms around me from behind, hands settling over mine on my belly. "She's at her violin lesson. Nora's bringing her home within the hour." "Your son's very active today," I said, leaning back into him. "I think he's trying to negotiate an early release." Callum laughed, a real laugh, the kind he'd learned to give freely only in the last few years, and rubbed slow circles against my stomach. "Patience, little one. You've got another month before you meet us." Our son kicked hard at the sound of his father's voice, and we both laughed. "He recognizes you," I said softly, "just like Iris did. The last 5 years hadn't been simple. There'd been sleepless nights, toddler tantrums, disagreements about parenting philosophy that occasionally got heated enough to require a night on the couch, mine, by choice, so I could hear if Iris called out. There had been doubts, too, mine, mostly, about whether I'd left my old invisible life behind too easily, whether I even recognized the person I'd become. But every time those doubts rose, I looked at what we'd built together and found the answer waiting for me already. "She's going to be a handful," I predicted, thinking of our daughter and her 3 equally stubborn parents. "She already is," Callum said, with the particular affectionate exasperation reserved only for Iris. "Yesterday she informed me she's decided to become a marine biologist and asked if we could convert the pool into a habitat for sharks." I laughed, imagining it. "What did you tell her? That we'd start with goldfish and work our way up?" "She's now negotiating for a koi pond." Riss appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, tie loosened, jacket slung over one shoulder. "There's my family," he said, crossing the room to fold himself into the embrace, sandwiching me between the two of them in the way that had, somehow, over the years, become the single safest place I knew. "Long day," he said, answering my unspoken question. "But worth it. Every meeting's worth it when I know I'm coming home to this." He knelt in front of me and pressed his ear to my belly. "Hello in there. Your dads are very excited to meet you. Your sister's excited too, though she's a little nervous about sharing her toys." Our son answered with a flurry of kicks, as if he understood every word. He's going to be a fighter, Reese said, grinning, just like his father's. God help us, I said, though I was smiling too. Between Callum's stubbornness and Reese's competitive streak, our household had never once suffered from a shortage of strong opinions, and I had a feeling our son would arrive with plenty of his own. I'm hoping for my temperament, I said dryly. Someone in this family needs to be the calm one. You're plenty calm, Callum said. You're the anchor that keeps the rest of us steady. Tell that to the koi pond negotiations, I said, and he laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it rarely had been in those first tense weeks after the elevator. The front door opened before I could argue, and Iris's excited chatter came ringing down the hall ahead of her, small feet thundering into the nursery a moment later. "Papa!" she shouted, launching herself toward me. Reese caught her mid-flight and redirected her into a gentler hug. "Careful, sweetheart. Papa's belly is very full of your baby brother right now." She gentled instantly, pressing both small hands to my stomach with exaggerated care. "Sorry, Papa. Sorry, baby brother." She leaned in and whispered, as if sharing state secrets. "I'm going to teach you everything when you get here. How to tie your shoes and read books and everything." My eyes stung. I had no doubt at all that she would. She'd inherited my patience in flashes, and Callum's relentlessness the rest of the time, and the combination usually meant that whatever she set her mind to eventually happened, whether the rest of us were fully ready for it or not, which, on reflection, was probably the most useful trait either of her fathers could have passed down to her. That evening, after Iris had been read to sleep by both her fathers, a nightly negotiation over whose story got told first that never seemed to lose its charm, the three of us sat together in our room, unhurried, the way we always did once the house had gone quiet. "Do you ever think about that day in the elevator?" I asked, my head against Callum's shoulder while Reese rubbed my swollen feet. "Every day," Callum said. "Best decision I ever made. Letting that elevator stall. You mean the best manipulation," I teased. No real heat behind it. I'd forgiven him for that particular scheme years ago, once I'd learned, much later, and with real amusement, that the Nathan on the public elevators that day had in fact been arranged. "I prefer fate-assisted matchmaking," he said primly, and I laughed despite myself. Reese looked up from my feet, his eyes soft in the lamplight. "I think about how different everything would be if you hadn't stepped into that elevator, Ren. If we'd never found out what it felt like to be complete." His words settled something warm in my chest, a small, quiet reminder of how far the three of us had come since that terrifying, overwhelming afternoon 6 years ago. We'd built this life through heat cycles and hostile takeovers, through a pregnancy scare and a genuinely alarming amount of toddler chaos, through a truth about my own past none of us had expected to uncover, and through every bit of it, the bond between us had only deepened. "I wouldn't change any of it," I said quietly. "Not one moment. Every hard part led us here." "Neither would I," Callum murmured, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Not a chance," Reese added, finishing with my feet and crawling up the bed to complete the circle. We lay there together, the three of us and the child, growing steadily beneath my heart, held by something that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice, chosen and rechosen, every day since a stalled elevator on the 47th floor had rewritten the entire shape of my life. Somewhere down the hall, Iris murmured something in her sleep, the way she often did, and for a moment the three of us went quiet, listening, out of the same old instinct that had never quite faded no matter how many years passed. When she settled again, Reese let out a breath and laughed softly at himself. "I don't think that part ever stops," he said. "The listening, I hope it doesn't," Callum said. "I think I'd miss it if it did." For a while none of us said anything else, content to simply lie there together in the dark, listening to the ordinary sounds of a house that had somehow, over 6 unlikely years, become the safest place any of us knew. I thought, lying there between them, of the person I'd been the morning of the elevator, invisible on purpose, careful on purpose, so certain that the safest life was the smallest one. I thought of Odalus's plant-crowded kitchen, of a father I'd never met who'd spent the last months of his life fighting for people like the person I turned out to be. I thought of a stalled elevator and 2 brothers who'd been raised to need no one, undone in the space of an afternoon by a stranger in a rumpled shirt clutching a folder of paperwork. None of it had gone the way any reasonable person would have predicted. I found, turning it all over one more time in the quiet dark of our bedroom, that I wouldn't have wanted it to. "Tell me something," I said, half asleep already, my hand finding Callum's over the curve of my stomach. If you could go back and unstick that elevator early, get us all out before any of it happened, would you? He was quiet long enough that I thought he might already be asleep. Then, not for anything in the world. Good answer, Reese murmured against my shoulder. It's the only honest one, Callum said, quiet and sure, and I believed him completely. Outside, the city kept its usual restless hum, the same skyline that had watched 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays come and go, indifferent to the fact that one of them, 6 years ago, had quietly become the hinge on which an entire life turned. I closed my eyes, my family breathing steady around me, and let myself drift, unhurried, toward sleep. I woke once more before morning, briefly, to find Callum still awake beside me, one hand resting lightly over the place where our sun turned and settled beneath my ribs. He didn't notice I'd stirred. He was simply watching, the way he sometimes did, as if he still couldn't quite believe any of this belonged to him. "Go to sleep," I murmured, half into the pillow. "In a minute," he said, and I let him have it, because I understood, better now than I had 6 years ago in a stalled elevator with my whole life unraveling around me, that some things were worth staying awake a little longer to hold on to. I wouldn't have traded a single second of it. If this story pulled you in even for a second, don't scroll away without dropping a comment. Tell us which of the twins you'd have trusted first. Hit like and subscribe so we know to keep these stories coming. Because honestly, we love making them almost as much as you love watching. Thank you for staying till the end. We'll see you in the next one.